do everything we can, as a party to make sure that we win this race, because losing is not an option when it comes to the state of Texas and what it means for our majority in the Senate.
This is SRN News.
Welcome to the Spirit of Truth with your host, Steve Esch. Today is the second part in a series that we're doing about Islam. Now, you won't read any of this stuff in emails or on websites or anybody who's pushing a political agenda. It's based upon personal experiences from when I was living in a Muslim country, on Islamic history written by Islamic scholars, and from the personal testimony of former followers of Islam. And we'll seek knowledge about Islam's past, its founder, ideology, divisions, and its possible part in prophecy. And I tell you, this will not be politically correct, and it will not be an apologetic for Islamic ideology. Now, there's a point that I want to make here, and we're going to make it again several times before we're through with this series. In the Western world, people usually use the words Muslim and Islam interchangeably, like they mean the same thing. Nothing could be farther from the truth. They are not the same thing. They're not even close to the same thing. The term Muslim refers to an actual religious belief, and it consists of the five pillars of the faith, dietary laws, and certain standards of modesty. Islam refers to an entire ideology, and that's a set of comprehensive belief system about everything in human experience. So it covers history, it covers prophecy, it may cover why are we born, what happens when we die, how should power work in government, how should financial systems work, how should legal systems work, how should punishment work, what should punishments be. Pretty much everything to do with an entire society in the whole spectrum of the human experience in that society constitutes what's called an ideology. And it includes a complete worldview. And now, one small part of that is the Muslim faith. But someone can be Muslim and be absolutely against Islam, and I have personally seen that a lot. And Turkey is probably the best example of a Muslim nation that does not follow Islamic ideology. Now, it was the seat of the largest Islamic caliphate over the last 700 years, and the biblical descriptions of the nations engaged in Armageddon are described as coming from the north of Israel, and Turkey is therefore a necessary part of the end times investigation. And there's many different commentators with their personal agendas, and they all have simplified views that tend to come from their politics or emotions. But the truth of it is a far more complicated reality. Now, the talking heads on TV and don't generally have the personal experience and detailed knowledge that would give them an accurate understanding of the issues regarding Islamic ideology or dealing with it. But scriptures tell us to seek knowledge free of bias, and from knowledge seek understanding, and from there seek wisdom. And that path demands a whole lot more than mere opinion. Now, the last part we did this for part one, we laid a foundation that sees that difference between the words Islam and Muslim. They are not interchangeable. And in the largest view, remember this, Islam is an entire worldview that covers everything to do with government and religion and legal and financial and everything, whereas Muslim is just a simple statement of faith. Now, there's only two major ideologies in the world today, communism and Islam. And these two ideologies are incompatible with each other and incompatible with all the principles of America and Christianity. Now, an ideology creates a total governing worldview. And it covers all those things, like we said, including its own view of history, and explains such things as why human beings exist and what our ultimate future is and how people relate to government and even what the future will look like. and it tolerates no other worldview that would contradict it. Now, I lived among the local population in the city of Izmir, which was called Smyrna in Jesus' times, on the west coast of Turkey. In fact, it's where one of the churches founded by Paul was. And I lived among the local population. In fact, my alarm clock each morning was the imam coming out onto the minaret, the porch that's around the mosque's tall, thin towers, and calling out the 5 a.m. Muslim prayers to the city. In the villages up in the mountains and on the seacoast, I met a hard-working, friendly Muslim people. And the villagers still lived a lifestyle not much different from biblical times. And there were only 3 major cities in Turkey: Izmir on the west coast, Istanbul, which was Constantinople in earlier times, and Ankara, the capital in central Turkey. Now there's Incirlik also there now. Now, outside these cities, most villages in that time that I was there were just beginning to see such modern technology such as telephones. Life was simple, much like a small American country town around 1900. The social life of the men in the villages was centered in the village chai house, where coffee and tea were the main beverages and local gossip and weather were the main subjects of discussion. And this is where the village men met to solve all the problems of the world. Now, their religion discouraged alcoholic beverages, although wine was still common in the cities. And they lived by a moral code that asked for honesty, consideration, and self-reliance in general, and observance of a few basic Islamic tenets. Now, like Judaism, they would not eat pork or even touch any part of a pig, which is called a domus in Turkish. These people were Muslims who lived in a society in which only the religious part of Islam was practiced, while all the other parts of Islamic ideology were outlawed in favor of a modern constitutional society. Now, the Muslim faith, as a religion only, in a secularized modern society, is very different from the Islamic ideology. Now, Turkey has Sharia law, but only for religious matters. And they have their own versions of non-Islamic law based on the Italian model for all other legal matters. So let's take a look at Turkey's past. Now, before Mustafa Kemal, who became known as Ataturk, led the Turkish Revolution, Istanbul, Turkey was the capital of the Muslim Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire covered what is now most of North Africa, Egypt, Turkey, Greece, Hungary, Romania, southern Spain, and most of the Balkan countries. And it began around the 1200s when a faction of the Turkish tribes engaged in conquest to increase the spread of Islam and, of course, get booty for themselves in accordance with the Quran, settled in Anatolia, which is what we call Turkey today. And they sought to conquer Europe, Asia Minor, and the Middle East. And by the mid-1400s, the Turks took Constantinople, which was, until then, the Christian capital of the Eastern Orthodox Christian religion. In 1444, a coalition of the European armies lost a major battle near southern Poland, and all Europe was afraid that the Islamic Turks would conquer all of Europe and Christianity would be wiped out. And this threat led to the Crusades. Now, the idea that the Crusaders were Christian conquerors trying to steal Islamic land is a lie. The Crusades are a response of Christian Europe to the Muslim aggression into the Christian and Jewish Holy Land and into Europe. The Middle East, before the Islamic Wars of Conquest, included Jerusalem and much of North Africa, which were heavily Jewish, Christian, and pagan. Even towns in Arabia and Turkey were Christian before there was Islam. Now, part of the Turkish army during the Islamic Wars of Conquest were Janissaries. And these were Christians who were captured, educated in Islamic ideology, and trained as soldiers from the time they were children. And they were required to provide military service as a tax on unbelievers. And eventually, after many years of service, they could be elevated into the Muslim Ottoman bureaucracy. And it was actually Islamic Ottoman. The final advance of the Ottoman Turks was stopped at Vienna, Austria, south of Germany, in the 1500s. The Islamic conquest of Europe ended there, and the Turks retreated to south of Poland. But much of the Eastern European territories conquered by Islam remained under Islamic control until the end of World War I in 1918. Now, by the 1600s, the Ottoman Empire had settled into an Islamic bureaucracy. Other religions were tolerated under dhimmi, an inferior status, in former Christian territories. And that ended in the 1890s when the Sultan Abdul Hamid II declared Islam as the official rule of all the Ottoman Empire territories. This led to the massacres of hundreds of thousands of non-Muslims, particularly Armenians who were mostly Eastern Orthodox Catholics. Now, during the period of 1900 to 1923, the Islamic Turkish leaders decided to exterminate every Armenian in the country, about 2 million people. When the Islamic government's collapse occurred at the end of World War I, the following Turkish governments, one after another, the ethnic killings continued, this time against the Greeks and the remaining or returning Armenians. And various Turkish regimes, which only lasted a year or two, killed from 3.5 million to 4.3 million Armenians, Greeks, Nestorians, and other Christians. Now, during this period, Turkey fought 5 internal wars, changed governments several times, and was occupied by foreign powers. Turkey suffered deportations, famine, exposure, war, genocide, massacres, and millions of Turkish Muslims, Armenians, Greeks, and other Christians died. Now, this is mostly denied today by the Turkish government, but a treaty in 1923 caused over 1 million Greeks to move from Turkey to Greece and about 400,000 Muslims to move from Greece to Turkey. In 1918, Mustafa Kemal, a Turkish army officer later called Ataturk, led the final Turkish revolution. And he was kind of like the George Washington of Turkey. When Ataturk threw the Allied powers out of Turkey in 1923, the modern nation of Turkey was created, with Ataturk as his first president. A constitutional, democratic republic, much like ours, was formed. It included freedom of religion, and it applied equality for women. And today, Turkey is about 99% Muslim, mostly of the Sunni version. And Islamic ideology is actually forbidden in the affairs of government by the Constitution, and the judges can declare any attempt to change that as illegal. Now, much of early Christian history is found in Turkey. For example, Ephesus was one of the first Christian churches established by Paul, and I've been there during its early excavations. And the remains of ancient Roman aqueducts are common. They're everywhere in western Turkey. When the Catholic Church divided into the Roman Catholic Church with its own doctrines, the Eastern Orthodox Christian religion became based in Constantinople, which is Istanbul today. And that's up in the northwestern corner of Turkey. And Christianity was a major religion in the Turkish regions until the Ottoman Islamic conquest in 1455. Now, today, Turkey has more than 120,000 people of different Christian denominations, including Oriental Orthodox, Roman Catholics, Antioch Greeks, Greek Orthodox, and Protestants in Turkey. There's also a population of Sephardic Jews. Turkey even hosts the largest number of refugees in the world, including more than 2 million Syrians. And that last one, well, that could present a major problem today, as many Syrians are not secularized, but are committed to the Islamic ideology of conquest. Now, in 2014, Erdogan, who was the prime minister since 2003, was elected president. And he has used increasingly authoritarian tactics to silence voices of opposition. Accusations of corruption were revealed in December of 2013. Every prosecutor, judge, and police investigator associated with the case against Erdogan's family and allies have been fired, arrested, or relocated. Erdogan also presided over an increasingly more radical Islamic attitude in Turkey. And part of this radicalization is caused by the Kurds, who are wandering tribesmen trying to create a separate state out of eastern Turkey. Now, Erdogan's tone is increasingly more like radical Islam. Erdogan is an ally of the Muslim Brotherhood, identified by nearly all Western nations as a Muslim terrorist organization. which tries to change society through state intervention. The majority of Turks today want to maintain the society that Ataturk left to them, but the voices of radicalization are rising, especially among the Syrian refugees. And even students who are having a harder time finding jobs are finding a sense of identity in this new Islamic ideology. Now, a map of the Middle East shows that as you go north from Israel, you pass through Lebanon, through the western edge of Syria, and into Turkey. And Turkey is by far the largest country north of Israel, short of Russia. And the other Muslim countries of southeastern Europe are north of Turkey. Now, in the book of Revelation, the army of the north represents a coalition, a combination of nations who invade from the north. And such an invasion would then have to come through Jordan, Syria, and Turkey. So as long as Turkey remains a nation who allies with the West as a NATO ally and recognizes Israel, this is not likely to happen. But if Turkey radicalizes, all bets are off, and the door would be opened to a northern alliance that could fill that prophecy. So Turkey is very special because it has shown that a Muslim nation can exist, which is our friend, and mirrors the freedoms that the Islamic ideology cannot tolerate. So now let's explore Muhammad, the founder of Islam, and the actual history of Islamic ideology, which is what he created. All movements, ideologies, and religions have a founder who gave the basic doctrines that define that movement. And all such things, even games, are defined by their rules. The founder or his biographers wrote the founding documents that formed that original orthodoxy. Now, in time, as new people take over, the original doctrines can be challenged and divisions can result. And we see this in Christianity, starting around its second 100 years. And we see it in America and in communism, socialism, and Islam as well. Now, from these divisions arise two general groups. Those who follow the original doctrine are commonly called originalists or fundamentalists. And for example, in America, those are people who believe in what the founders taught and the government and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that they created. Now, the greater the time from the foundation, the greater are the differences. And this is just human nature in action. But these differences can often become very antagonistic. Those who take the fundamentalist road try to practice the views of their movement's founders. And this is why the nature of a group's founder or founders is so critical, because as the founder was, so will his followers tend to be. Now, many people think of Islam as a single monolithic religion. It's not. First of all, it's not a religion. It's an ideology. Secondly, it's fractured. Just as Christianity is generally some form of apostolic Catholicism or some variation of Protestantism, so Islam is generally some form of either Shia or some variation of Sunni. The fundamental book of Islam is the Quran, and the second one is the Hadith. And the Shia and the Sunni each have their own versions of both. Today, the fundamentalists in Islam are responsible for most of the terrorism, killing, and aggression we see in the news. And this takes place everywhere from Asia to Africa. The fundamental reason for this lies in the founder himself, Muhammad. And that's why we cannot understand the nature of modern fundamental Islam until we know something about Muhammad himself. As Moses was to Judaism and Jesus is to Christianity, so Muhammad is to fundamental Islam. Now, Muhammad was born about 570 A.D., son of Abd Allah bin Abd Muttalib, into the Banu Hashim clan of the Quraysh tribe. Now, the Quraysh tribe was a powerful merchant tribe who controlled numerous trade caravans that traveled throughout the Middle East, and they carried a lot of the trade goods, and they controlled Mecca. Now, curiously, they actually claimed Jewish tribal ancestors. In their belief system, they were descended from Adam, Abraham, and Ishmael. Moreover, yet they had as many as 360 gods, and each tribe had its own favorite. And all of those gods were called Allah, which simply means the local god. Now, the greatest of these was the moon god Hubal, Interestingly, the moon god's symbol was the crescent used by Islam today. And the moon god that they worship may have been related to an ancient Babylonian moon god. Now, each god was represented in Mecca by a stone, claimed to have fallen from the sun, moon, or stars. Now, the greatest was a black stone, possibly a glass fragment from a meteorite, about 12 inches in diameter, in the Kaaba, a shrine in Mecca. The pagan Arabs would walk around the Kaaba several times, then go inside and kiss the stone. Now, the early pagan Arabs also prayed 5 times a day toward the Kaaba in Mecca and fasted for part of each day during 1 month each year, just as the Muslims do today during Ramadan. Now, every one of these early pagan practices is a major part of Islam today, and Islamic traditions are rooted in ancient paganism. In Muhammad's times, the area through which the Arab trade caravans passed included many Christian and Jewish villages, as these were found everywhere, even in Arabia. And Christianity was divided into various factions already, based largely on their views of the nature of Jesus. Some said Jesus is divine, an expression of God. To others, Jesus was one of a trinity of separate persons. Some said Jesus was the Son of God, but not divine. And this was the religious makeup of the region into which Muhammad was born and raised. Now, Muhammad's father died before Muhammad was born. So his mother, Amina, died when he was 6 years old, and he was taken by his grandfather, Abd al-Muttalib, who died when he was 8. Now, up to this time, Muhammad was dirt poor. He was the poorest of the poor. And when his grandfather died, he was then raised by his uncle, Abu Talib, who was also poor. So when Muhammad was 13, his uncle Abu Talib, a textile merchant, started taking him along on the way on the caravans. And these included different versions, and he heard on these trips Muhammad would listen with rapt interest to the tales of other religions that they encountered and that he heard about along the way as the caravans went around North Africa. And these included different versions of Christianity, Judaism, and other pagan religions. In fact, his tribe was mostly pagan with some Christians. Muhammad's own family, believe it or not, were mostly Christians. Muhammad was illiterate. He couldn't read or write and relied on his memory of what he heard on these caravan trips. Abu Talib never recognized Muhammad as a prophet, nor did he accept Muhammad's religion. Muhammad's second uncle, Abu al-Hakam, was a very well-educated, a Christian teacher with a large private library. In fact, he's actually quoted as saying, and this is Muhammad's uncle, if Muhammad had moral strength, he would say Christ is the truth. Now, in those times, most of the Middle East, including Arabia, were pagan, Jewish, or Christian. And many of the Arab traders who went all over converted to Christianity and spread it around. Until Muhammad was 25 years old, he remained under Abu Talib's guardianship. And that's when he married his first wife, Khadijah, a wealthy 40-year-old widow. Now, until he married into money, Muhammad was still dirt poor. And what's interesting about his being 25 when he finally married is that at that time and in that place, most young men married at around 18 years old. But Muhammad was too poor to find a wife, and being single at 25 was actually considered kind of odd. At some point, Muhammad claimed that he began to see and hear some kind of spirit and received instructions from it. And he was afraid that he was either insane or being attacked by a demon or encountering an angel. So he confided in Khadijah that he was afraid to go into the desert because of it. He was in terror. His body would tremble and his color would wash out. According to Islamic scholars, Khadijah devised a test. And the story is as follows. Khadijah asked him to tell her when this apparition came. And when he did so, she uncovered her head and chest. And she asked if he could still see the figure. And when he said no, she reassured him, saying the spirit left because it was embarrassed, and a demon would not be embarrassed. She told him that she was seeing an angel. Still, Muhammad believed that a demon or an angel had squeezed his neck and tried to choke him to death. And sometime after that, when he saw the figure, he would panic and even pass out from fear. Now, it's interesting to note that all other appearances of angels in Scripture report the angel telling people not to fear, other than perhaps the wrestling match between Jacob and an angel. In all biblical encounters, the person is left with a feeling of gratitude for being in the presence of one of God's messengers. Muhammad was afraid. Something fishy here. So Muhammad did not dare seek any other wives until Khadijah died at the age of 70, when Muhammad was 53. And she left him a considerable inheritance. Now, Muhammad was a man of strong appetites and soon married 2 wives in the same night. One was 27-year-old Sauda bint Zama, and the other was Aisha, who was 6 years old at the time. And Muhammad was very considerate of her. He didn't have sex with her until she was 9. I can't even imagine what that must have been like. Well, that brings us to the close of this particular session, and we will continue our exploration of the history and the nature and of Islam probably next week. So until then, God bless you, and thank you for listening.
God has things he wants people to know, and one of the ways